Hi, everybody. Hopefully I'm not as echoey out there as it sounds to myself, like was being pointed out. So I'm going to be talking about Ionic version 4 today. And there's a URL here if you want to take a look at my slides. So I leave that on the board for a split second. And okay, cool. And that way you can bring them up and follow along at home, or you can just, stare at the screen as you wish. Okay, so first of all, who am I? I'm actually the guy that started AngularNYC, which is kind of cool because here I am talking at AngularNYC, something I haven't done in a while. So I'm really happy to be here. Although I am talking about a subject I've talked about before, which is Ionic, although I've never spoken about Ionic version 4 before. I am a systems architect. I am a developer. I do training. I have an extensive engineering and agile, extreme programming background. I graduated from MIT. I worked at Google. I worked with Pivotal Labs and numerous Fortune 500 companies as a consultant. I also founded Zen Digital, which is my consulting company. Me and some trusted other engineers. We work on enterprise training, consulting, and best practices. We do team augmentation, full stack JavaScript, as well as Java development and other languages. Focusing lately on agile and safe agile framework, so DevOps and continuous integration, continuous development, and making sure that proper value streams are aligned for your company, as well as testing practices. And I mentioned here that I do mobile solutions, and one of the things I do mobile solutions with is Ionic. So, okay, so I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do today. I'm just going to give you an overview of Ionic version 4. I'm then going to do some live coding, or at least some cut and paste coding, because I did it earlier, and I actually uploaded it to GitHub. So there is a copy of the app I'm creating today on GitHub, and that's done in version 4. Also, if you want to follow along on your cell phone, in other words, as I make edits to the mobile app, you can actually view those edits on your cell phone locally. You need to do two things. One, you need to connect to the AngularNYC Wi-Fi network. Now, obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, that's not going to work for you. So don't bother that. This part, if you're on YouTube, this is not going to work for you guys. However, if you're sitting here right now and you want to download the IonicDev app, I created an account called devappdemo. So you can just log in and run that locally. So if you want to take the time now on either an iOS device or an Android device to download the IonicDev app and connect to this Wi-Fi network, you will be able to see the changes live as I make them, which is one of the very cool features that's available with Ionic, and so I figured why not show that to the crowd live. And I do that by creating an open Wi-Fi network, AngularNYC, that I brought with me that doesn't have segmentation, so you'll be able to connect to my laptops that's serving up the Ionic app. Okay, so let's talk about what Ionic actually is. It is, and you can check that out at ionicframework.com. It's an open source UI toolkit that enables developers to build performant, high-quality mobile apps. It uses familiar technologies, or at least technologies we are familiar with as Angular developers. That's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it's focused mainly on the front-end user experience and the UI interactions that are created on a mobile application. It integrates very nicely with Angular, but nowadays with version 4, it actually integrates much nicely with other JavaScript frameworks, which is kind of one of the new features of version 4. And nowadays, with version 4, it can be used standalone without a framework using what some people call the VanillaJS framework. So it's cross-platform. It actually works on iOS, now iPadOS as well. You can create Android apps with it. Using Electron, you could create desktop apps. It can be used to create web or progressive web apps. It even has options for creating apps for Windows Mobile, if anybody has that. And this can all be done with one code base. And this is kind of closer to write once, run anywhere that I've seen. I was one of the original Java developers, and I think the joke back then was write once, debug everywhere. So Okay, so it's completely based on web standards. It's built on top of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as I mentioned, and it uses modern web APIs. Especially version 4 is focused on custom elements and the shadow DOM, something that version 3 didn't actually use. Ionic components have a stable API and aren't at the whim of a single platform vendor. One of the issues with previous versions of Ionic was it was trying to be compatible with Angular, but as Angular kept updating, it kept chasing after Angular, and it realized that it had to create a disconnect from Angular, and that's one of the reasons that it's now using custom elements in the shadow DOM, and that's what's giving it the ability to work with these other frameworks. I'm sorry. Oh. Okay. It has a beautiful design, or rather a beautiful aesthetic, if you will. If anybody's used Twitter Bootstrap to create a web application quickly, that's one of the sort of the features you kind of get from Ionic. You have the ability to create a web-based mobile application quickly with widgets that are at your disposal and ready to go. And I'm going to be showing off some of those widgets shortly. The framework is designed to work and display beautifully out of the box across all platforms. It has a somewhat generic look and feel initially, but that can, of course, can be styled with CSS as you please, and of course you can change all the colors and the fonts as you go forward. And it has a pre-designed components, it has typography, it has interactive paradigms that are built in. It's a gorgeous and yet extensible base theme. So the extensibility is what allows you to customize that and make it look like it's built for your app and not like everybody else's app. It has a tremendous amount of simplicity. It has that in mind so that creating Ionic apps is enjoyable, especially if you already know Angular. It's easy to learn and accessible to just about anyone with web development skills. So instead of having to learn Swift and Java, if you're not into those things, you can take the skill set you already have and extend it to mobile. It is a free and open source software API. It's released under the MIT license. That means it can be used in personal or commercial projects for free. MIT is the same license used by such popular projects as jQuery and Ruby on Rails. The documentation content that's found in the Ionic docs repo is also licensed under the Apache 2 license. So it has a lot of framework compatibility. Past releases of Ionics were tightly coupled to Angular, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. But version 4 was re-engineered to work with standalone web component libraries. And this is using a new technology that was created by the Ionic framework group that uses Stencil JS. And just for a show of hands, how many people here have heard of Stencil JS? Okay, so really small percentage. So I'll show what Stencil JS looks like, and you'll be surprised if you already know Angular. Stencil JS will look surprisingly familiar. And it integrates for the latest JavaScript frameworks that are available. As I mentioned, you're going to be able to use this with React, and you're going to be able to use this with Vue, as well as VanillaJS. And of course, for a very long time, they've been supporting Angular. So let's see if I've got, oh, and that's actually my next slide. So I've actually ruined my next slide by already speaking it. So some frameworks will need a shim for full web component support. But in general, and React and Vue are actually still sort of in beta. Angular, on the other hand, is the original, and because now it's web components and custom elements, you can do VanillaJS out of the box if you want. I wish I had a link already to Stencil. It's coming up, but I'd love to show you what Stencil JS, and I will do that shortly. So separate from their open source offering, Ionic, of course, has some commercial offerings. So I'm going to mention that because they can help you support your application development. I have looked into and have yet to use any paid version of their commercial support, although they do have a free level, the free starter plan that's available, and I am already signed up for that. And that's actually the example login that I handed out to everybody at the very beginning. That was done with their free starter plan so that everybody could log into the IonicDev app without having to create an account if you want to see the live updates. So for production apps, you have the ability to compile native app builds. So in other words, instead of you having to compile iOS and Android applications on your own machine from the CSS, JavaScript, and HTML, you can actually outsource that to the cloud and basically get Ionic to do the compilation down to an APK or an iOS app for you. They'll also be able to deploy live code updates so that if none of the actual native portions of your application have updated and only the CSS, HTML, and JavaScript have updated, they'll actually host the updated versions of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and there's a mechanism within the application that will sense that there's a newer version and download the newer version without you having to update through the App Store. So these updates that don't require any native updates can actually be done without updating in the App Store. There's a centralized dashboard, and there's workflow automation to simplify the creation of apps with a single sign-on and connected service integration. And here I have a link here to the Ionic app flow, so I'll just show you. It allows you, as I've mentioned, I'm really into Agile, so having anything that allows me to do continuous integration and deployment is really important to me. In the past, I've done what they're able to do in the cloud using Jenkins, and you can configure Jenkins to do this as well if you're into that sort of thing, or you can outsource to Ionic framework itself and their app flow. So let's take a look at what the actual UI components in Ionic look like. So here's a list of all of them, and if you've actually connected to my presentation, all of these are hyperlinked to the documentation. I'm just going to go to the main one here and try to give a quick overview of what's possible. So for instance, for action sheets here on the right, maybe I'll go full screen to try and, or maybe I'll shrink my, there we go, make it sort of fit. There we go. So I can say show action sheet, and here's an action sheet. Notice it looks, by default, it looks very iOS-y, but this is all HTML and CSS that you're looking at here, as is evidenced by the fact that it's in a browser. And up here I can say show me a material design version, so you can, with the exact same code, you can make it look like this on Android. And in fact, you can deploy your application so that the exact same code base has an iOS look on your iOS version and has a material design look on your Android version without having to change much at all. You can also specify some icons. We'll get into that. Let's go back. And here's an alert. We're going to be using this in my live coding demo a little bit. So here's an alert, and you can agree or disagree. And of course, I can show you the material design version. And there's an alert with material design. You can see the look and feel is very much Android and iOS. And this is all, again, once again, HTML. So, basically what's going on under the hood, because I haven't mentioned it so far, is you're running Cordova. And Ionic is running on top of Cordova. So for those of you that are already familiar with Cordova, it's basically running a web browser inside of an application and then rendering that web browser in the application. Thus, this is a hybrid application. This is unlike some of the newer techniques that are being used with NativeScript, which uses Angular, or React Native, which uses React, which actually uses native GUI elements from either iOS and Android, and then ties them all together with JavaScript. This, of course, your actual UI is actually HTML. Let's see if there's any other of interest. A simple button. You'll notice that buttons can be colored, that they have the ability to sort of give you that, they have the ability in material design to give you that ripple effect that I like so much. You can sort of see it when you do it in the corner, that it sort of ripples out, etc. So you can take a look at these on your own. And okay, so what do you need to actually get started with Ionic? Well, first of all, you need to have Node installed and an npm environment. So you want to install globally Ionic, and then once you have the Ionic command line, you can then say Ionic start. You can specify the name of the application. So here I called it my app. And then there's a number of templates that are available. One of them is the tabs template. So this is just an example. I could say Ionic start my app and then tabs. If you leave off the name of the template, it's actually going to query you and say, hey, which template do you want to use? And one of the templates that's available to you is the blank template. And then once it'll create a folder which with a package.json all ready to serve up your application, and you can actually go into that folder and then serve your application. This is And this will actually run a web server and open up a web browser and show your application running locally. So you can actually then start developing your application. So if you want to build for iOS and Android, as I mentioned, it currently requires the Cordova installation. So if you wanted to do that, you'd need to install Cordova. And then, once again, you can connect to the AngularNYC Wi-Fi. I wrote here Ionic demo, this from a previous example. And you can preview the app I'm about to show you in the IonicDev app. So just to show of hands, just so I have a sense of how many people I need to support with this, how many people actually bothered to download the IonicDev app? Okay, and you're on the AngularNYC Wi-Fi network, and you were able to log in using the credentials here, correct? Okay, so that being said, I have a blank application here. I've actually added one other thing, which is the Ionic Lab, which gives you a really nice representation of your app in the browser. It formats it so that it's the size of a mobile application, and it shows it to you both in an iOS version and a material design version side by side, and that way you can actually get a sense of what your app's going to look like in both. And once this is up and running, you should be able to see that Ionic To-Do v4 is going to be the name of the application displayed. So here is a blank templated application. And I will also show you the file system that creates this. Whoops, not this one, sorry. This one. Okay, so here on the left, you can see the file system of what the Ionic command line actually created. And this, I haven't modified anything here yet. So it creates a source folder. This looks very much like a brand new Angular application. It does create the concept of a home page, which is a little bit new, something that you wouldn't get by default in an Angular app. There's environment, there's potential themes, et cetera here, and it also has end-to-end testing support. All the same testing support you would get from Angular is built in. And if we look at the home page, you'll see the same content that we actually see on our application. The world is your oyster. Ionic blank is the title. If you get lost, the docs will be your guide, and there's a link to the docs here. So how many people have been able to get this application? Great. So I've got 2 people here that are actually able to see this application. So I'm going to change the title now to say, I don't know, to-do app, and I'm going to save that. And you'll notice that updates, you know, it's a standard browser sync. It updates here. Now, everybody who has been running this should see that update instantly on there. And so this is one of the great powers of Ionic, is the ability to quickly preview what you're working on. So I'm creating a to-do app today, so I'm just going to show you how I would go about creating a to-do app. So I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to create an Ion list. And in that Ion list, I'm going to create some Ion items. And I'll just create item 1, item 2, and item 3, and I'm going to save that. And I'm going to move back here, and hopefully that'll, what did I forget? All right, there we go. And there we go. We see now I have a list of items here. And that should be updating for those of you that have actually got it up and running. So that was sort of like step 1 of I'm going to try and create a to-do app. I want to be able to display my to-do items here. So my next move, and I will admit, I'm going to cheat because I have a version that I've already ran the app. And so here's the one that's actually already running, and just make my life easier. So my next goal is going to be to data drive. And so to data drive it, I'm inside of my constructor, I'm going to initialize an array of items. Now, the array of items that I'm going to initialize, I'm not giving them a type yet. Now, it's TypeScript, so at some point in the future, I might want to refactor to say an item has a title that's a string and has a done variable that's a Boolean. I leave that as an exercise for you guys. I'm just trying to quickly push an app out the door. I am an agile guy, so I would recommend that that be done before the code actually goes into production, but I'm just trying to give an example here, so you'll have to forgive me. So, so here is a little bit of code. I'm going to open up the TypeScript portion here. Whoops, not the module, but the page. And let's see, what did I? Here, I now have an array of items. Now, of course, just saving that's not going to actually display anything different because I now have to do an ng-for loop to substitute what I have here. So I'm going to say ng-for equals, well, here, it's item, yeah. Yeah. So I'm just going to copy this to make my life easier because I'm going to be moving. I got a few steps to do here. And okay. So now I have an ion list that has an ng-for loop that has a variable called item for each element. And so each specific ion item, actually, I'm going to show the title inside of it. So let's take a look as I save this. I switch here to my to-do app, and bam. Here I am. I have these multiple items here. I feel like my spacing's a little off, but I'm sorry, it's the list?
Yeah, the ng-for should look like.
Oh, right. Thanks. It's funny because I did this earlier and it looked fine. There you go. That looks much better. Okay, so I might have to update that as I go along. So now I have this data-driven. I've data-driven the app, but I have no way to tick off each item and say, hey, that's actually done. So in order to do that, I'm going to want to use a little CSS. And I have an example of the CSS that I want to use. So let me just bring it up here. So for the applications in its CSS, I'm going to say, hey, when the task is done, I'm going to change the text decoration to be line through. So that I'll say, hey, you know, I'll put a line through it. I could also change the color slightly. I've done that in the past. But that should do. And so now, as I switch back to my application, the actual HTML, I'm going to change each item so that the class, here I'm going to format this a little bit better and say, oh, let me say class.taskDone is equal to whether or not the item is done. So if the item is done, then the task will be done. And let me actually change the task. So the task actually is done, data drive the app. I've already written that down as true. So let's go back here and save it and see if, whoops. And there we can see that I'm data driving the actual UI. So now I have a line through the item that's done. So my next move is I want to be able to toggle them. So let's create a click element. So I keep going. Let's click. So I'm going to say, hey, item.done equals not item.done. So this should allow me to click on an item and change the toggle state. So you can see that's pretty quick. Without a lot of coding, I'm able to get a fair amount of functionality. So now I've got data-driven and toggle items done. Let's be bold and try to create a new item. So to create a new item, I'm going to add a button at the top inside of my toolbar. I'm going to say, hey, I want a list of Ion buttons, and this, of course, is tags. These are actually custom elements that come with Ionic that I'm taking advantage of, and these custom elements have also been given some additional Angular features, But because of the new version 4, these were all created in Stencil, which generates custom elements, web components that don't require a framework. Once you're using Angular, then the Angular features have been added to these custom elements. So you can do this with a vanilla JavaScript framework. So once again, here I've got my Ion buttons, and I'm going to put them, I want them to be on the right side, so I say they're going to be in the end slot. And I now want to add an Ion button that when I click on this Ion button, I want it to open up my add item. Now I haven't created add item yet, but I'm going to shortly. And what do I want this to look like? I'm going to use an Ion icon. And there's actually a bunch of icons that are available. In particular, they have one that's called add, which is really just a plus sign. And here's my Ion icon. And just so I have some words next to it in case somebody doesn't realize that the plus sign is actually what is add item. I'm actually going to put the words add item. And I'll come back here and let's take a look. And so now I see in the upper right-hand corner, I have an add item button. But if I click on it, nothing happens. Why? Because I haven't actually written the add item functionality yet. So let's work on that next. Now, this is actually probably going to be one of the most complex parts of what I'm doing here today. So give me a break if I make a mistake, since I'm doing this live coding. Okay, so I have an add item, and this actually, what I'm going to create here is an alert. And like the one that I actually already demoed a little bit earlier. And you know what? I'm going to make this an asynchronous, I'm going to take advantage of, you know, 2017, I don't know what it is, I'm trying. Version of JavaScript that actually now has async. This, you know, the actual alert returns a promise, and so by using async, I can say, hey, await for this. Now, I need an alert controller. Now, alert controller is actually a controller available through dependency injection, but I haven't actually used dependency injection. I need to go and say, hey, I want an alert controller available to me. So I do that, and you'll notice because I'm using WebStorm, it automatically imported the alert controller from Ionic Angular. So that's something that's now available to me, and I can say, hey, this .alert controller, I want to create an alert, and the alert I am going to create has a number of features, and I could look at the documentation. We were actually looking at it earlier. UI components. Let's see if I can get, here's alert, and I guess I was hoping it would go straight to the documentations. Here's the usage, just so you get an understanding of what it looks. And here they actually recommend using the async and creating an await for the create. So here, I'll just copy this for right now, just to make my life easier. And then typically I'll do an await alert present, so I'll actually present it. And this way the function won't return until I've actually completed. So this is just, let's see if I got something, I think await, right, there we go. So let's take a look at what happens when I click on add item. So here's like your standard alert. I haven't actually customized it yet, but let's customize it so that I can actually accept something inside of it. Also notice we have, so which platforms, iOS and Android, looks very, very much the same at the moment. Usually one will look like iOS and the other one will look like, so I want to add an item. That's what I want my header to say. And you know what? I don't really need a subheader for this. I really don't need a message for this. What I really need is what's known as an input. So of the inputs, you can put an array of them. In my case, I need a name, and it's going to be a task, let's say, or an item. And I can also create a placeholder for this. And I'll just say, hey, this is a new task. And I don't really need a message either. but I do need a button, at least a cancel button. So I'm going to say, of type text, and I think, oh yeah, I need to specify its role here. So I think that's right. Let's see, do I need to put, oh yeah, I need to put this as an object. Okay, so let's see what happens now when I click Add Item. It's starting to look a little bit better, right? It says Add Item. And then finally, once I have this item, I need to do something. Right now I only have a cancel button, but if I add additionally a concept of another button, create, a create button with a handler that will actually get called when I actually press this button. So I give this handler, let's see, I think I don't need, do I have another? Yeah, of course I'm going to get stuck in how many close parentheses do I need, but I'll deal with that afterwards. So this is the function. I say, hey, if I have data inside of my, if I have a task inside my data and it's not equal to an empty string, then I'm going to say this dot items, which is my array of to-do items. I'm going to push a new to-do item. And what I need in my to-do item is a title. And that title is going to come from data.task. And by default, I'm going to say that done is false. In other words, all new items that are added are going to be false. So I'm just, let me use it. Double equals there, I guess, is what it's recommending. And let me make sure I've got the necessary. It's kind of looking good. Let's see. Hey. So let's see what happens when I click on Add Item now. So here we go. So I'm going to say, hey, this is a new task. Create, and bam, it actually added the new task to my array. Told you that was going to be a little bit of, so I can actually add new items. So hey, I was able to toggle items and I was able to create new items. I'm actually moving along. So next I want to be able to delete items in this application. So let's go back just to the UI portion. And what I'm going to say is, hey, where do I want my UI for deleting items to be? And I'm actually going to add a new concept that's available inside of, and this is going to, and that is an ion sliding list. Item sliding, there it is. And I'm actually going to have to move this ng4 up to there, because I want there to be as many sliding items as there are items. And also, in order to accomplish this, I'm going to need an index. So I'm going to create the variable I inside of here that actually has. The ion sliding allows each item to actually slide to the side. You're probably familiar with this from email applications where you slide the email in order to archive it or delete it. So that's the functionality that I'm creating here. And that's one of the advancements, again, of Ionic. It gives you these UI elements for you to use, and this is one of them that I find very useful. So before I close my list, I'm going to close, and let's see, I can reformat there. Okay, that's looking a little better. And then now I need to create the buttons that will appear inside of, and that goes inside of a section called Ion Item Options. So here are my Ion Item Options, and I'm going to put an Ion button in there. And the button is going to be a color, which I haven't gone over the colors, but you can actually have, I want it to be red, danger. So, and when I click on this button, I want it to delete. So I'm going to just use splice, and I'm going to splice I out of So I've created my index I. I'm going to splice I out of my items array. So I think that's all. So let's take a look at what we get now. I can now toggle to the side. My button doesn't look that great. Let me add the word delete there and see how it looks now. Whoops. Hey, a little bit better. So I can now click on delete, and I think my splice command was a little bit off. Let's see. Items.splice of I indexes I. Oh, right. Comma 1. Yeah, that's right. So let's try it again. Delete, and it deletes just one item. Great. My UI is a little bit off. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to just keep moving forward. And I did, just to let you know, I did put this, a working version of this application. In the last slide here, you can actually go to my GitHub. It's the latest application. I uploaded it there. And I put each step as a separate branch. So if you want to see it step by step, you can look at it in each branch. And going back to my application here, so now I'm able to delete one item. And okay, so my next move, let's go back to my application here. So I was able to, let's refresh. I was able to toggle the items, create new items. I'm able to delete items. So I'm down to my last task. And then I'll feel like I've created a fully functional application for your pleasure right here in front of you. Live. Are we live? Yes. Okay. So this is also a little bit difficult, but I'm going to do some cut and paste to make it easier for myself because I'm going to take advantage of the same alert we used to create the new item to do the edit functionality. So first I'm going to create the button. I've already got a button here, so let me just duplicate that button. And this time, I'm going to use, instead of it being red, I want it to be yellow. So I'm going to use warning instead of danger. I'm going to say edit is the name of this button. And instead of putting the code directly here, which was kind of a bit of a cheat, I'm instead going to say, hey, let's call edit item. And for edit item, I'm going to pass both the item and I am going to create a local variable called sliding item. And that's because after I'm done editing, when I deleted, it was easy. I deleted the item and it disappeared. But when I do the editing, the slider that I opened is not going to close automatically unless I ask it to. So I am going to pass a local variable sliding item as well so that I can actually ask it to close. And now I can say, hey, I was going to try and just automatically create, but no, let's go back to, what's that? I'm sorry, I missed it. So I'm just going to say, hey, this is kind of going to be very similar to what I already have here. So I'm just going to duplicate and change this to edit item. And I'm going to call this edit item. And for my inputs, I'm going to have to add a new feature. But, and also my button, when I click on the final button, it's going to say create, and this code here is going to change, right? This is going to be, let's call that to do for a brief moment. And hold on while so now for editing, I need to bring in a value. And so where I had new task as my placeholder, now I want to pre-populate the value with, edit item is going to take item and sliding item, right? And the item dot title is going to be the pre-population for my edit, right? So that whatever the current version of my task title is going to pre-populate this. And now I want to say item dot title equals data.task, right? That's data.task is whatever comes back from my alert. Item.title is what I'm setting with the new edited title. And then finally, I'm going to say sliding item.close with any luck. And so let's take a look. So let's see if that actually just works out of the gate. So first I slide. There's now an edit button, and it does not yet open, so I did something wrong. I didn't put it in the template. I didn't say click equals at.
Items are added instead of added items in the template.
Items.edit. In the template, which is over here, I said.
Remove no.
What?
Remove items dot.
Which line?
The line you're on, but remove the items dot.
I'm sorry, which line?
The same line.
Okay. Oh, items. Oh, item. Okay, I see. Right. And it's called edit item. Sorry, this is where cutting and pasting, or even just duplicating a line, actually messes me up. Okay, so we slide it. I've got my edit button, and there it is. Toggle items. New toggle items, and I click edit, and now it says new toggle items. Okay, we're done with the application demo. The live coding demo is over. Okay, so I'm just going to go back and finish up on my slides. So I was going to talk about Stencil JS, which is how Ionic created all these custom elements for the version 4. Stencil JS, I told you I'd show you what it actually looks like. And of course, let me see, I might just be off the internet. No. Maybe they just changed the, that's weird. Maybe the website is actually down. Weird. Okay, well, nothing I can do about that unless there's a cached version. Hey, cached versions to save the day. So I just wanted to show you what it looked like, and I was hoping there'd be an example on the home page, but of course, without a quick example. And the point I was going to make is that it looks a lot like Angular. So you're writing a component in a language, Stencil, that looks a lot like Angular, but instead of requiring a library like Angular in order to run a Stencil component, it compiles down to a web component, a native web component that doesn't require any framework in order to run. So that's kind of the magic of what Stencil does. It creates VanillaJS components that work with the web component standard that's built into all the major browsers. Okay, so going back to that. So Stencil JS generates standards-based web components with the virtual DOM and async rendering, reactive data binding, TypeScript, and has JSX support. It simplifies writing fast, more capable components for multiple frameworks. It has an extremely tiny API because it actually embeds that API. It has wide browser support, and I think this was the link to the first component, but of course, their website's actually down. It's not me. Okay, so optionally for Ionic development, you can use Ionic Pro, as I mentioned, and the dev app that some of you got to see me actually drive this application with. If you're doing iOS development, you're going to need Xcode. You're going to need the Apple Developer Program for individual or for teams. You're also going to need an Apple Developer account. And if you're doing Android development, you're going to need Android Studio, and you'll probably want a Google Play Developer Console account so that you can actually push your app to the App Store. Once again, the to-do app example is available online. That's it. I'm done, and I'm open for questions. Thank you very much. Still don't know why it didn't look pretty there. Yes, questions?
The last thing you mentioned was that
I'm going to repeat the question anyway so that people at home can hear you. No problem. Are they both on?
Yes.
You need them both. One's for the home audience, one's for here.
So the last thing you mentioned was that it's a very small footprint for
Stencil JS.
Can you compare it to what a web Angular element web component would look like?
That's an extremely valid question. I don't know off of the top of my head. And that's actually what would drive. I will say this: that Stencil came out before. Angular's components have really, made it to the mainstream, and they were really large to begin with. I would say both companies are working to shrink their footprint. I would say Angular's probably behind, but working hard at it. Was that it? Was that the only question?
Okay. So you said in the beginning, before version 4, Ionic is very tightly related to Angular now is not. Does that mean Ionic is not very stable?
Well, that was the lack. It was the fact that it was tied to Angular that was making it less stable, or rather, it was leaving it behind. So that Angular would have a new version, and then Ionic was fighting to keep up with the versions of Angular. Now, because the Stencil JS is a separate piece, it's much easier for them to just update the version of Angular and tie it to the Stencil components instead of having to, because it was all kind of wired together before, and now it's separate pieces. So I wouldn't say there's a similar concept with Android these days where they're trying to partition parts of the operating system so that it can be updated much easier by the vendors, and this is the same concept, so that as somebody updates the version of React, as they update the version of Vue, and as they update the version of Angular, it will be possible to use potentially the same version of Ionic under the hood with the newer versions of Ionic, Vue, and React.
Do you know if this gives you access to the mobile APIs, such as like Bluetooth or geofencing or anything like that?
Yes, actually, I have an example application, which if anybody wants to see it afterwards, I created a QR code scanner, and in particular, that's tied to the native camera and a QR code analysis of the camera input. And that's not something I wrote, I just was able to take advantage of that library. That question is so good that I'm actually going to try. Let's look at the Ionic native plugins. And so what they did was they created TypeScript libraries that wrapped around a lot of existing Cordova plugins. Once again, this is built on top of Cordova. And as you may know, Cordova already has access to all of the native Bluetooth, native GPS, native with tilting and stuff like that. So what happens is now you have all these libraries, and I'll try and zoom in on the right, 3D touch capabilities, and you actually get TypeScript wrappers around these Cordova plugins that allow you to integrate them with Angular. And in version 3, they were so tightly bound to Angular still that some of these are actually Angular-based. Now, of course, they're trying to decouple a little bit more from Angular and make them just JavaScript-based, but typically they're promise-based or in some cases RxJS-based, so that you're not locking up the operating system. And there's a huge list of plugins that are supported. I'm just scrolling through them here. I've experimented with a few of them, and that allows you to bring in you can use native dialogues if you want to bring in some native UI components, native dialogues, and native Toast components. You can do visual stuff. You can bring in a native Google Maps if you wanted to. I actually worked on bringing in ads into the application I'm working on using AdMob. Just trying to see if what was possible. So if you want to see an example of that application afterwards, let me know. And that ties natively to the camera. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention.